On the 15th of February, 1942, British Singapore fell to the rapidly expanding Imperial Japanese Army in what Churchill dubbed the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British military history. Upon their arrival, the Japanese administration proclaimed Singapore a part of the Japanese Empire, renaming the island to Syonan Island in honor of Hirohito, the Showa Emperor. Yet, despite the official designation of Syonan as a part of Japan, its people were treated as colonial inferiors. This video will analyze the impact of colonial rule on Singapore. It will demonstrate how Japanese authorities maintained order in the territory and constructed a facade of peace and cooperation, while simultaneously harboring the express intention of exploitation behind closed doors. The video will be split into 3 sections, looking at the Japanese administration of Singapore, the Sook Ching massacre, and the attempted Japanization of the territory respectively. There has been ample research conducted on the Battle of Singapore and the military aspects of Japan's takeover of the island. Works such as Masanobu Tsuji's memoirs have colored such studies. However, studies of Japanese colonialism concerning Singapore specifically remain limited, with most works choosing to focus on regions such as China, Taiwan, and Korea. As is the case with the study of the Pacific War as a whole, there remains little crossover between the already limited English language and Japanese historiography on Japan's occupation of Singapore. This has necessarily resulted in relatively isolated understandings of the period as a whole. Yoji Akashi and Mako Yoshimura's 2008 book titled New Perspectives on the Japanese Occupation in Malaya and Singapore 1941 to 1945 attempted to rectify this through the translation of a number of Japanese language essays into English. Recent studies have focused not only on incorporating both English and Japanese sources, but also on engaging far more with cultural history. Kate Imey has written about the Japanese occupation through the lens of gender, race, and intimacy. Similarly, Kevin Blackburn has written extensively on the occupation, focusing on oral histories and collective memory. Upon the 25th Army's takeover of Singapore, the Gunseibu was assigned to administrate the region, at the head of which stood Major General Takenobu Manaki. Yet while Takenobu was in command on paper, it was his subordinate, Colonel Watanabe Wataru, who administered in practice. By July of 1942, Watanabe was able to push Takenobu out of administration, gaining control of both the Gunseibu and the General Affairs Department. Having previous experience in military administration in Manchuria and China, the Watanabe Gunsei was based on 3 main policies. The first policy, Misogi, or spiritual cleansing in English, was described by Watanabe as being to require them to account for their past mistakes, and to make them ready to give up their lives and property. Only when they repent their wrongdoing will I allow them to live, and I will return their property once they repent. The horrific effects of this policy can be seen in the Sook Ching massacre, which will be discussed later in this video. The second policy, mui ni kas, or to leave things as natural as possible in English, was meant to prevent what Watanabe deemed misgovernment with good intention, and keep in place structures of administration and society that had been proved to work. The third and final policy, ho sansho, or the fewer regulations on administration, the better in English, allowed for administrators to take initiative and not be barred by red tape. However, aspects of Watanabe's Gunsei principles clashed with the Japanese overall aim for the region. The finance minister, Kaya Okinori, had made Japan's aims abundantly clear when he said, "We will have to pursue a so-called policy of exploitation and adopt a policy of self-sufficiency." Watanabe saw the policy of self-sufficiency as contrary to his policy of misogi. Furthermore, he was dissatisfied with the lack of any mention of building the East Asia co-prosperity sphere, and the fact that the Gunseibu was only given limited power. Up until his transfer in 1943, he would constantly clash with other elements of the 25th Army's administration, vying for power. This struggle shaped the Japanese administration in Singapore and Malaya. In contradiction to the policy of self-sufficiency, Watanabe negotiated with the 15th Army in Thailand for the import of rice into Malaya and Singapore. This, along with the emergence of black markets, the opportune geography of the island, and a further loosening of the policy of self-sufficiency after Watanabe's departure, ensured that Singapore was able to narrowly avoid famine during the occupation, despite the Japanese policy of economic exploitation. Apart from the forceful extraction of food and resources, the population was also economically exploited through taxation. The Japanese made a concerted push to encourage gambling, which would allow officials to increase tax revenue. They also put in place state lotteries. Other outlets of entertainment, such as amusement parks and movie theaters, were also taxed. These policies of economic exploitation contributed to high levels of inflation, further impacting the population. Furthermore, the Singaporean population was also exploited sexually, as the widespread Imperial Japanese system of comfort women was extended to Singapore. The policy was forced upon both local women as well as women from other parts of the empire that were brought to Singapore. Watanabe's policy of misugi is also evident in the first edition of the Shonen Times, published in February of 1942. It promises good fortune and happiness for those that cooperated with the Japanese, speaking of a start of a new order and co-prosperity sphere in East Asia. It later also warns that the Nippon army will drastically expel and punish those who still pursue bended delusions as heretofore, those who indulge themselves in private interests and wants, those who act against humanity or disturb the public order and peace, and those who are against the orders and disturb the military action or Nippon army. Although good fortune and happiness is certainly an overstatement, those who collaborated with the Japanese did fare much better under the occupation. Working with the Japanese ensured greater rations and housing, to the point where most Singaporeans were wholly reliant on the Japanese for survival, a policy engineered to diminish the possibility of a rebellion. However, rewards of food and housing were not all that kept rebellion at bay. From its inception to its very last days, the Japanese occupation of Singapore was characterized by the brutal reign of the Kempeitai, Japan's military police. Stories of horrific torture and public displays of decapitated heads struck fear into the hearts of the local population. While the promise of extra rations and special privileges was the carrot in Japan's colonial policy, the threat of torture and murder by the Kempeitai was the stick, together ensuring almost complete subservience to Japanese rule. Overall, it's abundantly clear that despite the struggle between the Watanabe Gunsei and other elements of the region's military administration, the overall policy of Japan and Singapore was that of exploitation and terror. The administration offered the absolute minimum to its population, dangling the fantasy of an East Asia co-prosperity sphere in front of them, while simultaneously wringing them dry through terror and force. As previously touched upon, terror formed the backbone of Japan's occupation of Singapore. The Japanese considered Southeast Asian and Malay culture to be inferior. They divided the population into two categories, those being subhuman and non-human. Subhumans were those who collaborated with the regime, and non-humans were those who did not cooperate and could be used for unskilled labor. The Chinese population was specifically targeted. The Kakkyo Kosaku Jishi Yoko, or Policy Implementation Guidance for Overseas Chinese in English, states that as long as people obey and willingly cooperate with the Japanese military government, the Japanese army will not deprive them of their business and will allow them to maintain their rights and interests. But if they disobey and fail to cooperate with the Japanese military government, the Japanese army will forfeit their right to live. Initially, the Chinese population was allowed to fly the Chinese flag, given that they flew a streamer with the words "Peace and National Construction" alongside it, to show their support for Wang Jinwei's collaborationist government. However, even this was swiftly put to an end. Watanabe reiterated his policy of misogi in his treatment of the Malay Chinese, saying that they must be held accountable for their past misdemeanors. It is my policy to make them reborn with a clean slate. The policies of misogi and hosansho allowed and encouraged Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji to take the initiative and unleash further terror upon Singapore's Chinese population. Instead of simply following direct orders to eliminate resistance to Japanese rule, Tsuji took it upon himself to carry out the murder of Chinese civilians almost indiscriminately. Orders were given to eliminate 50,000 supposedly anti-Japanese Chinese adult males, a whole fifth of the pre-war Chinese adult male population of Singapore. The massacre was meant to send a message to would-be resistors, reinforcing Japanese control over the population. Even after the killing, the remaining Chinese population was forced to raise $50 million for the Japanese as a show of loyalty. The massacre left a deep scar on the population, one that long outlived the Japanese occupation and can still be felt today. Thousands of Chinese families were left with no source of livelihood. Processing grief was made further difficult by the fact that the victims' bodies weren't returned, which meant that burials and mourning rituals were unable to be carried out. Furthermore, many didn't know if their family members had been killed or would one day return. The Sook Ching massacre, along with other acts of terrorism committed by the Kempeitai and wider Imperial Japanese Army, provide perhaps the most glaring example of the lasting devastation caused by Japan's colonial rule beyond the economic exploitation of the island. The administration took a relatively pragmatic approach to cultural assimilation, in accordance with Watanabe's principle of muinikas. Outwardly, they claimed that they wished that the civilization of the people here be preserved. However, being officially considered a part of the Japanese Empire, a key objective of the occupying forces was certainly to assimilate Singapore culturally. Apart from the renaming of the territory from Singapore to Syonan, many streets and buildings were also renamed. Naturally, there was a push to impose the Japanese language on the local population. The colonial administration even went as far as to enforce Japanese Standard Time on the territory. One of the most central components of this Japanizing effort was the establishment of a Shinto shrine in the city, which was planned almost immediately after the 25th Army established control. Named Syonan Jinja, the shrine would promote the cult of Emperor Hirohito. However, its functions extended beyond simply the export of Shintoism. To leave it at that would be deceptive. The shrine was to become the center for Japanese cultural activities in Syonan. Sport in particular was given priority. Disguised as a seemingly non-political activity, many engaged with and even appreciated the sporting activities held at the Syonan Jinja. Here too, the carrot and the stick approach can be seen, with locals of all faiths being forced to pray at the shrine by the military, but also enticed to engage with the shrine on their own accord through the holding of other community-building activities such as sporting events. These sporting events were naturally embroiled with Japanese propaganda. M. Shinozaki proclaimed to the Singaporean people that, "Through this sports spirit we shall deepen the understanding, affection, and the spirit of fraternity among the great Asiatic races." Such language presented sporting initiatives as a step toward the creation of a greater East Asia, a tactic which was clearly successful. An example of its success can be seen in the case of former Olympic hockey players Gurmeet Singh Kullar and Ali Iqtidar Shah Dara, who were able to be recruited into Japan's Indian National Army in Singapore through such messaging. The political undertones of these sporting initiatives became more clear as the war went on, and activities such as shot put were replaced with militarized ones, such as grenade throwing. As mentioned earlier, the Japanese language was used as a means of cultural integration. This singular aspect of Japanization was undoubtedly the most central to the Japanese. It was seen as the vehicle through which to inculcate the Japanese spirit into conquered peoples. The Nihongo Fukyu Undo Sengen, Declaration of the Japanese Language Campaign outlined to soldiers and administrators the importance of spreading the Japanese language, declaring, "We should teach them Japanese as a means to communicate with each other and eradicate cultural differences among them. The day all of these new national citizens speak Japanese, however broken it may be, is the day we accomplish the construction of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere." A subset of the population certainly did make an effort to learn Japanese, hoping to gain favor with the occupiers. That being said, despite declarations on the importance of the language, the practical degree to which Japanese education was enforced was limited. While the 25th Army did make an effort to make Japanese education available, the resources to properly do so were thoroughly lacking. The majority of such education consisted of the memorization of Japanese patriotic songs and a few phrases. Furthermore, the Singaporean people themselves were largely not receptive to learning Japanese, leading to a comprehensive failure of the Japanese plan for the language to replace English as the lingua franca. All in all, Japan's attempts at culturally integrating Singapore were deliberately pragmatic, and its outcomes were mixed. When it came to cultural assimilation through language, the efforts made were lackluster. Yet in terms of exposure to Japanese culture through the Syonan Jinja and sporting events, we can see a higher degree of success. Although locals didn't abandon their religious beliefs for Shintoism and emperor worship, some bought into the fantasy of the East Asia co-prosperity sphere through such initiatives. Ultimately, the Japanese perceived the cultures of Singapore to be inferior, and used the fact that they remained unintegrated into Japanese culture as a basis on which to justify their exploitation. In conclusion, the Japanese occupation of Singapore provides valuable insight into the broader impact of Japanese colonialism. It elucidates the fact that exploitation and terror remained at the core of Imperial Japanese policy. The economic devastation of Singapore and the Sook Ching massacre were not isolated one-time mistakes, but were rather emblematic of a deliberate Japanese policy stemming from deeper ideological beliefs. These beliefs were largely rooted in the notion of cultural and racial superiority, which formed the basis for the justification of their crimes against humanity. In the case of Singapore specifically, Japan's occupation left its mark not only through its oppression and devastation, but also through the humiliation of the British, which accelerated the process of Singaporean and Malay independence following the war.